After years of silence, he comes back a self-made millionaire, carrying the weight of everything left unsaid. He finds his parents in the rain, trembling beneath a storm they never deserved. His next move shocks everyone and rewrites the story of their family forever. The windshield wipers fought against the Texas downpour as Ethan Miller's rental car crept down Maple Street, the headlights cutting through sheets of rain that seemed determined to erase the familiar landmarks of his childhood. 23 years had passed since he'd last driven this route, yet muscle memory guided him toward the small white house where he'd learned to tie his shoes, where his mother had taught him that kindness was a choice you made every morning, where his father had shown him that a man's word was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Seattle felt like another lifetime now, the gleaming offices of Miller Tech Innovations, the board meetings that stretched past midnight, the relentless pursuit of the next breakthrough that had consumed every waking hour for the past decade. Tonight was about keeping a promise he'd made to himself during a particularly brutal week of acquisitions and product launches. He would surprise his parents for their 40th wedding anniversary, would wrap them in the kind of embrace that said all the words he'd forgotten to speak during countless missed phone calls. The storm had grown fiercer as he'd driven south from Dallas, but Ethan had pressed on, imagining the look on Linda's face when she opened the door to find her son, standing on the threshold, soaked and grinning. But tonight, none of that mattered. He could almost smell the coffee that would already be brewing despite the late hour, could almost hear Robert's gentle laughter echoing from the living room where the old recliner still faced the television that predated cable boxes and streaming services. As he rounded the corner onto Willow Creek Lane, Ethan's heart lifted with anticipation. The porch light would be glowing yellow through the rain, casting that warm circle of welcome he remembered from countless evenings when he'd returned from school, from dates, from the handful of college visits that had eventually led him away from this place and toward the life he'd built with his own hands and endless determination. But the house was dark. Ethan slowed the car, squinting through the rain-streaked windshield. No warm glow emanated from the windows. No familiar silhouettes moved behind drawn curtains. The driveway, once cracked but welcoming, now seemed to stretch like a void toward a structure that felt more like an abandoned memory than a home. Something metallic glinted near the front door, something that didn't belong in the landscape of his recollections. He parked and stepped into the storm, the rain immediately soaking through his expensive wool coat, the kind of garment that marked him as successful, as someone who had escaped the limitations of small-town life. The water ran down his face as he approached the house, and with each step, the wrongness of the scene became more apparent. The windows weren't just dark, they were covered. The front door wasn't just closed, it was sealed with a padlock that gleamed silver and new against the weathered wood. "No," he whispered, the word lost in the thunder that rolled across the Texas sky. And then he saw them. Huddled against the side of the house, beneath a tarp that offered little protection from the driving rain, were two figures he almost didn't recognize. The woman's gray hair hung in wet strands around a face that had grown thin, and the man beside her seemed to have shrunk inside clothing that hung loose on his once solid frame. They were pressed together for warmth, their backs against the brick wall of what had been their home for 4 decades, looking like refugees in their own lives. "Mom? Dad?" The sound that escaped Linda Miller's throat when she saw her son was part sob, part prayer answered. She struggled to her feet, the tarp falling away to reveal clothes that had been soaked and dried too many times, shoes that had worn thin from too much walking on unfamiliar ground. Robert rose more slowly, his movements careful, deliberate, as if his body had learned to accommodate a pain that went deeper than arthritis or age. "Ethan," Linda breathed, reaching for him with hands that trembled from more than cold. "Oh, my sweet boy." The embrace that followed was everything Ethan had imagined, and nothing like what he'd planned. Instead of the warm reunion in a kitchen that smelled like home, he found himself holding his parents in the rain, feeling their fragility through wet fabric, tasting the salt of tears that mixed with rainwater on his cheeks. This was not the homecoming he'd dreamed of during late nights at the office, when homesickness crept through the spaces between spreadsheets and conference calls. "What happened here?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the storm. How long have you been?" "2 months," Robert said quietly, his words carrying the weight of dignity that had been tested but not broken. "We tried to call you, son, so many times." And in that moment, as lightning illuminated the broken landscape of his childhood, Ethan Miller felt something crack inside his chest. Not his heart exactly, but something deeper, something that had been holding his carefully constructed life together like mortar between bricks. The successful businessman, the tech innovator, the man who could solve any problem with enough determination and capital, found himself facing a puzzle that money couldn't fix and success couldn't undo. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last vestiges of the son who had left Willow Creek to conquer the world, leaving behind only a man who suddenly understood that conquest meant nothing if it came at the cost of the people who had taught him how to love. The diner on Highway 35 hadn't changed much. Same red vinyl booths worn smooth by decades of farmers and travelers. Same fluorescent lights that cast everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow. At 3 in the morning, it was nearly empty except for a lone trucker nursing black coffee and the night shift waitress who'd taken one look at the bedraggled trio and silently brought extra towels without being asked. Ethan sat across from his parents in a corner booth, watching steam rise from their coffee cups like small prayers ascending toward the stained ceiling tiles. Linda's hands wrapped around her mug as if it were the last source of warmth in the world, while Robert stared out the rain-streaked window, his weathered face reflecting both exhaustion and the kind of quiet shame that comes from having your private failures made public. "Tell me everything," Ethan said softly, his own voice sounding foreign to his ears, less assured than the tone he used in boardrooms, less commanding than the voice that had built an empire. This was the voice of a son who had just discovered that while he was conquering the corporate world, his own foundation had been crumbling. Linda glanced at Robert, who nodded almost imperceptibly. The gesture was so familiar, a silent communication perfected over 4 decades of marriage, that it made Ethan's chest tighten with a longing he couldn't name. "It started about 6 months ago," Linda began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your father's hours got cut at the hardware store. Nothing dramatic, just less work, less pay. We tried to manage, but the mortgage was already stretched thin after Dad's heart surgery last year." Ethan's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Dad's heart surgery? What heart surgery?" The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. Robert's eyes found his son's face, and in them Ethan saw decades of protection, of shielding, of a father who had spent his entire life trying to spare his child from worry. "It was minor," Robert said finally, though the way Linda's hand tightened around her coffee cup suggested otherwise. "Just a procedure. Nothing to bother you with when you were so busy with your company." "We called your office," Linda added quickly, as if the words were burning her tongue. "Several times. But that lovely wife of yours, she said you were in crucial meetings, said you were under enormous stress with some big deal, and she didn't want to add to your burden with family troubles." The coffee in Ethan's mouth suddenly tasted like ash. "Olivia told you that? She was so thoughtful," Linda continued, her voice carrying the kind of forced brightness people use when they're trying to convince themselves of something they desperately want to believe. "She said she'd handle everything, that she'd make sure you knew when the time was right. Said families sometimes have to protect each other from unnecessary worry." Ethan set down his cup with hands that had begun to tremble. Olivia had never mentioned any calls from his parents. Not once. In the past year, she'd made jokes about how peaceful their life had become without constant family drama, how his focus had improved since they'd established better boundaries with his childhood obligations. "What happened after Dad's surgery?" he asked, though he was beginning to dread the answer. Robert took over the narrative, his voice steady despite the pain that flickered across his features. "The medical bills were substantial. Insurance covered most of it, but not everything. We fell behind on the house payments, started using credit cards for groceries, for medication. I picked up extra work where I could, but at 72, he shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the limitations that age had imposed on a man who had once been able to fix anything, build anything, provide anything his family needed. We kept thinking we'd catch up, Linda added. Kept thinking something would turn around. But then the letters started coming. Legal papers, notices, words we didn't understand about foreclosure and repossession, and her voice broke, and she pressed her hand to her mouth as if she could push the shame back inside. We tried calling you again, Robert said quietly. Must have been a dozen times over the past few months. Each time, Olivia answered. Said you were traveling for work, or in meetings that couldn't be interrupted, or dealing with some crisis that required all your attention. He paused, studying his son's face. She said you'd asked specifically not to be disturbed with family issues while you were handling such important business. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a monotonous sound that seemed to echo the static building in Ethan's mind. 12 years of marriage, and he was learning that his wife had been intercepting calls from his parents like some kind of protective barrier he'd never asked for. Every missed birthday call, every holiday greeting he'd assumed they'd simply forgotten to make. All of it had been filtered through Olivia's judgment of what deserved his attention. The final notice came 3 weeks ago, Linda whispered. We had 48 hours to either pay everything we owed or... She gestured vaguely, as if the act of losing their home was too large for words. That's when we tried one more time to reach you, Robert said. It was a Sunday morning, early. We thought maybe we'd catch you before the business day started. But Olivia answered. And she... He stopped, glancing at his wife. She what? Ethan's voice was sharper now, cutting through the gentle atmosphere of the diner like a blade. Linda's eyes filled with tears. She said you'd made it clear that you'd moved on from your old life, that successful people couldn't afford to be dragged down by family members who couldn't take care of themselves. She said you'd specifically asked her to handle any calls from Willow Creek because they were becoming a distraction from your important work. The words hit Ethan like physical blows. He could hear Olivia's voice saying those things, could imagine the cool, reasonable tone she'd used to deliver such devastating lies. She'd probably believe she was protecting him, shielding him from what she saw as unnecessary emotional entanglements that might interfere with his success. That's not true, he said, his voice hoarse. None of that is true. I never said any of those things. We wanted to believe that, Robert said gently. But when the sheriff came with the papers, when they changed the locks and loaded our things into boxes, it was easier to think that maybe you really had outgrown us. Maybe it was better for you to not have to worry about your old parents who couldn't keep up with the world you'd built. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the Texas landscape. But inside the diner, Ethan felt a different kind of tempest building, one made of betrayal and rage, and a grief so profound it threatened to hollow him out completely. The man who had built a tech empire through careful planning and strategic thinking found himself completely unprepared for this revelation that his success had been purchased with the careful destruction of everything he'd actually cared about. His parents sat across from him, their faces bearing the quiet dignity of people who had been abandoned but refused to let bitterness take root in their hearts. And in that moment, Ethan Miller began to understand that the most important business of his life wasn't waiting for him in some Seattle boardroom. It was sitting right here in a small-town diner, holding coffee cups with hands that had worked their whole lives to give him the foundation he'd needed to build his dreams. The question now was whether those dreams were worth the price they'd been bought with. The motel rooms smelled of industrial disinfectant and decades of transient lives, but it was warm and dry, two things that suddenly seemed like luxuries beyond measure. Ethan sat on the edge of one of the twin beds, watching his parents settle into the other with the careful movements of people who had grown accustomed to sleeping in places that weren't home. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the window, but inside these thin walls, There was finally silence enough for the weight of what he'd learned to settle into his bones. Robert had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhaustion claiming him the moment his head touched the pillow. But Linda remained awake, her eyes fixed on the water-stained ceiling as if reading some text written there in languages of loss and endurance. In the amber light from the bedside lamp, she looked fragile in a way that made Ethan's chest ache. Not the comfortable fragility of age, but something sharper, more recent, carved by circumstances she'd never been prepared to face. "Mom," he said quietly, careful not to wake his father. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." She turned her head toward him, and he saw in her eyes the same wariness that had marked her face when she'd told him about Olivia's phone calls. It was the look of someone who had learned to measure her words carefully, who had discovered that truth could be a luxury not everyone was prepared to receive. "When you called my office," he continued, "did you ever speak to anyone else? My assistant? The receptionist?" Linda was quiet for so long that Ethan wondered if she'd fallen asleep with her eyes open. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Once, about 4 months ago, a young woman answered, not Olivia. She sounded surprised when I said I was your mother. She put me on hold for a long time. And when she came back, she said your wife had instructed the office that all family calls should be directed to your home phone." Linda paused, her fingers worrying the edge of the motel bedspread. The girl sounded uncomfortable, like she was reading from a script she didn't quite believe. Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. His assistant, Maya, had worked for him for 3 years. She knew his parents' names, had sent flowers when they'd called to congratulate him on various business achievements. The idea that she'd been given instructions to redirect family calls was impossible to reconcile with the woman who remembered his mother's birthday and always asked after his father's health. "Did Olivia ever mention visiting Willow Creek?" he asked. "Or having any contact with people here?" Another long pause. When Linda spoke again, her voice carried a note of confusion that cut through Ethan's heart like a blade. "She came here once, about a year ago. We weren't expecting her. She just showed up one afternoon while your father was at work. She was different than I remembered from your wedding. More polished, I suppose. She said she wanted to see the house where you'd grown up, wanted to understand your roots better." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. Olivia had never mentioned visiting his parents. In fact, she'd actively discouraged his own visits over the past few years, citing work obligations and social commitments that made travel to rural Texas inconvenient and impractical. "What did she want to see?" he asked, though he was beginning to dread the answer. "Everything," Linda said simply. "She walked through every room, asked about your childhood, looked at all your old photographs. She seemed particularly interested in the financial documents on your father's desk, said she was curious about how small-town families manage their money." Linda's voice grew smaller. "She was very complimentary about the house, said it was quaint and charming. But there was something in her voice, like she was studying us instead of visiting us." The pieces of a puzzle Ethan hadn't known existed began falling into place with sickening clarity. Olivia's sudden interest in simplifying their financial affairs. Her insistence on handling all their legal documents, including power of attorney papers he'd signed without really reading. Her gentle but persistent suggestions that he distance himself from childhood obligations that might hold back his professional growth. Did she ask about money? The question came out sharper than he'd intended, and Linda flinched slightly. "She mentioned that you were doing so well, that you'd achieved more than anyone from Willow Creek had ever dreamed of achieving." Linda's voice grew careful, measured. "She said successful people often had to make difficult choices about how to allocate their time and resources. Said families who really loved each other wouldn't want to be a burden on someone who was destined for greatness." The words were vintage Olivia. Reasonable, logical, couched in language that made selfishness sound like wisdom. Ethan could imagine her sitting in his parents' living room, her perfectly manicured hands folded in her lap, her voice carrying that particular tone of gentle authority she used when she was reshaping someone's perception of reality. "She gave us her card. Linda continued, her voice growing even quieter. Said if we ever needed anything, we should call her directly instead of bothering you. Said she'd make sure any family issues were handled appropriately without interfering with your important work. Ethan stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where the rain continued its assault on the parking lot outside. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, a man who'd been living someone else's life without realizing it, making decisions that weren't entirely his own, building success on a foundation that had been carefully engineered by someone who claimed to love him. The power of attorney, he said, turning back to his mother. Did she ever mention that? Linda's face went pale. How did you know about that? Because I signed one. Olivia convinced me it was just a legal precaution, something all successful couples did to protect their assets. His voice was flat, drained of emotion. What did she tell you about it? She said. Linda's voice broke, and she pressed her hand to her mouth. When she spoke again, the words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for months. She said you'd given her authority to handle any financial situations involving your family. Said you'd decided it was better for everyone if there was some professional distance between your business success and any complications that might arise from your background. The clinical language, the careful phrasing, the way personal relationships were reduced to complications, it was all unmistakably Olivia's approach to problem solving. She'd taken his love for his family and turned it into a liability to be managed, a risk to be mitigated through careful planning and strategic manipulation. She offered to help, Linda whispered, when the medical bills started piling up, when your father's hours got cut. She said there were legal ways to handle family financial crises that wouldn't impact your credit or your business reputation. She said she was protecting you from having to choose between your family and your future. Ethan sank back onto the bed, the weight of understanding pressing down on him like a physical force. Olivia hadn't just intercepted phone calls and isolated him from his family's struggles. She'd actively positioned herself as their advocate while systematically ensuring their destruction. Every act of apparent kindness had been designed to tighten her control over the narrative of his life. Outside, thunder rolled across the Texas sky, and Ethan Miller found himself wondering how many other pieces of his existence had been quietly rearranged by someone who claimed to love him. The successful businessman, the devoted husband, the son who'd outgrown his humble beginnings, which of these identities were actually his own, and which were carefully constructed facades designed to serve someone else's vision of who he should be? In the dim light of the motel room, with his parents finally safe but everything else in ruins, Ethan began to understand that tomorrow would require more than just financial solutions or legal remedies. Tomorrow would demand that he figure out who he really was underneath all the layers of manipulation and control, and whether the man he discovered there was worth fighting for. Dawn broke gray and unforgiving over Willow Creek, the storm having moved on to torment some other corner of Texas, leaving behind a landscape that looked scoured and raw. Ethan stood in the motel parking lot, his phone pressed to his ear, as he listened to the familiar ring that would connect him to his office in Seattle, to the life he'd built on foundations he was only now discovering were made of lies and careful omissions. Miller Tech Innovations, Maya speaking. How may I help you? The sound of his assistant's voice, cheerful and professional even at 6 in the morning Pacific time, made something twist painfully in Ethan's chest. Maya Rodriguez had been with the company since its early days, had watched him build it from a 3-person startup into a tech giant that employed over 200 people. She knew his coffee preferences, his travel schedule, and the names of his parents. Maya, it's Ethan. Oh, Mr. Miller, I wasn't expecting to hear from you today. Isn't this your vacation week? Her voice carried genuine surprise, tinged with the kind of concern that came from working closely with someone for years. Is everything okay? Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the question settle over him like a shroud. Nothing was okay. Everything he'd thought he knew about his life had been systematically dismantled in the space of a single night, and he was standing in a Texas motel parking lot, trying to figure out how to rebuild himself from the wreckage. Maya, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. His voice was steadier than he felt. Have you ever received instructions about how to handle calls from my family? The silence that followed was long enough for Ethan to count 3 cars passing on the highway, their drivers beginning whatever journeys would fill their ordinary Tuesday. When Maya finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured in a way that told him everything he needed to know. Mr. Miller, Yes. Mrs. Miller called about 6 months ago and explained that you'd been under tremendous stress. She said any family calls should be directed to your home phone so you could handle them personally, in your own time, without the pressure of workplace interruptions. Each word landed like a physical blow. 6 months ago, right around the time his father's hours had been cut, when the medical bills from Robert's surgery would have started arriving, when his parents would have been making their first desperate attempts to reach their successful son for help. Did that seem strange to you? He asked. Another pause. Honestly? Yes. But Mrs. Miller explained that high-level executives often need to compartmentalize their personal and professional lives, and she seemed to know a lot about business psychology. She was very convincing, and she said it was what you wanted. Ethan felt his jaw clench. Olivia's talent for making her manipulations sound like thoughtful consideration, for presenting control as care, was more sophisticated than he'd ever realized. She'd probably made Maya feel like she was participating in an act of kindness rather than enabling a cruel deception. Maya, I want you to pull the records of every call that's come in from area code 903 over the past year, every single one. I also want you to check our phone logs for any calls made to that area code from our office. Of course, Mr. Miller. Should I send those to your email? Yes. And Maya? He paused, watching a mockingbird land on the fence that separated the motel from the empty lot next door. From now on, any call from my family goes directly to me. No exceptions, no matter what anyone else tells you. Understood completely, sir. After hanging up, Ethan walked back toward the motel room, but stopped when he saw his parents through the window. They were awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, sharing a cup of coffee from the small machine that came with the room. Linda was wearing one of Robert's shirts over her own clothes, and something about the gesture, the way she'd wrapped herself in her husband's warmth because it was all they had left to share, made Ethan's throat close up with emotion. He pulled out his phone again and dialed a different number. Whitman, Hayes and Associates, this is Jennifer. This is Ethan Miller. I need to speak with David Whitman. Tell him it's urgent. David Whitman had been the Miller family's lawyer for over 30 years, had handled everything from Ethan's parents' will to the incorporation papers for Miller Tech. If anyone would know the legal intricacies of what Olivia had done, it would be David. Ethan! David's voice carried both surprise and warmth when he came on the line. Good to hear from you, son, though I have to say the timing is interesting. I was just looking over some documents that have your wife's signature on them. The bottom fell out of Ethan's stomach. What kind of documents? Well, that's what's got me scratching my head. Someone used the power of attorney you signed to authorize the foreclosure proceedings on your parents' house, expedited the whole process, waived their right to certain protections. Very unusual, especially since the document was supposed to be for emergency medical decisions, not real estate transactions. Ethan leaned against his car, the metal cold against his back. David, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I never authorized any actions regarding my parents' house. I didn't even know they were in financial trouble. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Ethan to hear a dog barking somewhere in the distance, the sound lonely and persistent. Son, David said finally, his voice heavy with understanding and something that might have been pity. I think you and I need to have a very long conversation. But first I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. What? Do you trust your wife? The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a fire that had burned too long undetected. Ethan found himself thinking about the woman he'd married 12 years ago, brilliant, ambitious Olivia Chen who'd made him laugh at a tech conference in San Francisco, who'd understood his dreams and supported his vision, who'd stood beside him as he built his company into something that mattered. But that woman seemed to exist in a different lifetime now, separated from the present by a chasm of revelations that he was only beginning to understand. The Olivia who had systematically isolated him from his family, who had used legal documents to enable his parents' destruction, who had turned his love into a weapon against the people who had raised him, that woman was a stranger wearing the face of someone he'd once trusted with his heart. "No," he said quietly, surprised by how easily the word came. "No, I don't." "Then we have work to do," David said. "How soon can you get to my office?" "I can be there in 2 hours." "Good. And Ethan? Bring everything. Every document, every phone record, every piece of paper you can get your hands on. If what I'm thinking is true, we're going to need all of it." After hanging up, Ethan stood in the parking lot for a long moment, feeling the Texas sun begin to warm the air around him. Inside the motel room, his parents were probably wondering what came next, probably afraid to hope that their successful son might actually be able to fix what had been broken. They'd spent 2 months sleeping on church porches and under tarps, holding on to their dignity by threads that had nearly snapped. But Ethan Miller hadn't built a tech empire by accepting defeat, and he wasn't about to start now. The man who had conquered Seattle's competitive business landscape was about to discover what he was really capable of when the stakes were personal, when the enemy wore a familiar face, when everything that mattered hung in the balance. He walked back toward the motel room, his steps steady and purposeful. The confused, devastated son who had stood in the rain 12 hours ago was already transforming into something harder, more focused. The real battle was just beginning. But for the first time since he'd found his parents huddled against their own house, Ethan felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. It was time to find out who Ethan Miller really was, when everything else was stripped away. The law offices of Whitman, Hayes, and Associates occupied the second floor of a brick building that had weathered 40 years of Willow Creek's economic ups and downs. David Whitman's corner office smelled of leather and old paper, the kind of place where handshake deals still meant something and a man's word carried more weight than any contract. Ethan sat across from the lawyer who had known him since he was 12 years old, watching David's weathered face grow increasingly grim as he reviewed the stack of documents spread across his mahogany desk. "This is sophisticated," David said finally, removing his reading glasses and fixing Ethan with a look that mixed professional concern with paternal worry. "Whoever orchestrated this understood exactly how to manipulate the legal system to achieve maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability." Ethan's parents sat in the chairs flanking his own, Linda's hand resting protectively on Robert's arm. They'd insisted on coming despite Ethan's gentle suggestion that they rest at the motel, and now he was glad for their presence. This wasn't just about legal strategy. This was about rebuilding trust that had been systematically demolished. "Walk me through it," Ethan said, his voice steadier than it had been in 24 hours. David picked up a document from the top of the pile. "The power of attorney you signed was indeed broad in scope, broader than most people realize when they're signing what they think is a simple emergency authorization. It gave your wife legal authority to act on your behalf in all financial matters, including real estate transactions involving family assets." "But my parents' house isn't my asset," Ethan protested. "No, but the accelerated foreclosure proceedings were. Someone used your authority to waive your parents' right to extended notification periods, to bypass certain protections available to elderly homeowners, and to expedite the entire process." David's finger traced a line of text that looked innocuous, but had apparently been devastatingly effective. "Your parents went from being 3 months behind on payments to being locked out of their home in a matter of weeks, instead of the usual 6 to 8 month process." Linda's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet office. "But why would someone do that? What could possibly be gained from making us homeless faster?" David's expression grew carefully neutral, the look of a lawyer who was about to say something his clients didn't want to hear. "In my experience, when someone accelerates a financial crisis involving elderly family members, It's usually because they're trying to create a situation where those family members become completely dependent on someone else's charity. It eliminates their autonomy, their ability to make independent choices. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had burned down everything they'd thought they understood about their family dynamics. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest as the full scope of Olivia's manipulation became clear. She hadn't just wanted to isolate him from his parents, she'd wanted to destroy their independence so completely that any future relationship would have to go through her, would be subject to her control and approval. "There's something else," David continued, pulling out a different set of papers. "I've been doing some research into similar cases, and I found some interesting patterns. In the past 3 years, there have been 17 families in East Texas who lost their homes through expedited foreclosure proceedings. 12 of those families had adult children who were successful professionals living out of state." Robert straightened in his chair, his journalist's instincts awakening despite his exhaustion. "You're saying this isn't an isolated incident?" "I'm saying someone has been using a very specific playbook to systematically destroy family relationships under the guise of protecting successful individuals from financial liability." David's voice carried the measured tone of someone delivering news that would change everything. "What happened to you wasn't personal, Robert. It was strategic." Ethan's hands clenched into fists. The idea that his parents' suffering had been part of some larger pattern, that their pain had been calculated and deliberate rather than the result of unfortunate circumstances, filled him with a rage that was both clarifying and terrifying. "Can we prove any of this?" he asked. "That's where things get interesting," David said, pulling out his laptop and turning the screen so they could all see. "I've been in touch with some of the other families affected by similar situations. 3 of them have adult children who were married to individuals who worked in financial consulting or legal services. 2 more had spouses who specialized in estate planning." The implication hit Ethan like a physical blow. "You think Olivia has done this before?" "I think your wife has been very careful to build a network of professional relationships that give her access to exactly the kind of legal and financial tools needed to manipulate family situations." David's voice was gentle but relentless. "I think she's been using her knowledge of how successful people think, how they prioritize their time and attention, to systematically isolate them from anyone who might compete for their emotional or financial resources." Linda's voice was barely a whisper. "But why? What could she possibly gain from destroying families?" David looked at Ethan directly. "Control. Complete, unquestioned control over the narrative of your life, your resources, your future. When someone has no family connections, no emotional obligations outside their marriage, they become entirely dependent on their spouse for social and emotional support. It's a very effective way to ensure loyalty and compliance." The office fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock that had been measuring time in this room longer than Ethan had been alive. He found himself thinking about the past few years of his marriage, how gradually his social circle had narrowed, how his old friendships had faded, how his world had slowly contracted until it consisted almost entirely of work and Olivia. He'd attributed it to the natural progression of adult life, the inevitable sacrifice that came with building something meaningful. Now he understood it had been engineered. "What do we do?" he asked finally. David leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from lawyer to family friend. "Legally, we have options. The power of attorney was misused. The foreclosure proceedings can be challenged, and if we can prove a pattern of deliberate deception, we might be able to pursue criminal charges. But Ethan," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "the legal battle is going to be long, expensive, and public. Are you prepared for your entire life to become an open book?" Ethan looked at his parents, seeing in their faces the quiet dignity that had somehow survived 2 months of homelessness and humiliation. Robert's weathered hands were folded in his lap, but Ethan could see the slight tremor that spoke of anger held carefully in check. Linda's eyes held a mixture of hope and fear, the look of someone who had learned not to trust in rescue but couldn't quite stop herself from believing it might be possible. "Yes," he said simply. I'm prepared for whatever it takes. Good, David said, closing the laptop. Because we're going to need to move quickly and decisively. If Olivia realizes that you've discovered her involvement, she'll have time to cover her tracks, move assets, prepare counter-strategies. The element of surprise is the only advantage we have. As they left the lawyer's office, Ethan walked between his parents through downtown Willow Creek, past the hardware store where his father had worked for 30 years, past the diner where they'd shared coffee and devastating revelations just hours before. The late afternoon sun painted everything in golden light that made the familiar streets look like scenes from someone else's life, someone who had belonged here before the world got complicated. Son, Robert said quietly as they reached the car, are you sure about this? Once you start down this path, there's no going back. Your marriage, your life in Seattle, everything's going to change. Ethan stopped walking and turned to face his father. This man who had taught him that integrity wasn't a luxury but a necessity, who had shown him that real strength came from protecting the people you loved rather than advancing your own interests. Dad, he said, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised him, my marriage ended the moment I found you and Mom sleeping in the rain. Everything else is just paperwork. And as they drove back toward the motel through the streets of his childhood, Ethan Miller began to understand that sometimes the most important victories required you to lose everything you thought you wanted in order to reclaim everything that actually mattered. The storage facility on the outskirts of Willow Creek looked like a monument to discarded lives, row upon row of beige metal doors that held the remnants of dreams that had grown too heavy to carry. Ethan stood beside his parents in the August heat, watching the facility manager, a woman named Mrs. Garcia, sort through a ring of keys that jangled like wind chimes in the still air. Unit 247, she said, stopping in front of a door that looked identical to all the others. Everything from the Miller house has been here since May. Storage fees are current through the end of this month, but after that, she shrugged apologetically. The lock clicked open with a finality that seemed to echo in the narrow corridor between units. When Mrs. Garcia rolled up the metal door, the smell hit them first. Mothballs and dust and the particular mustiness that comes from lives interrupted mid-sentence. The sight that greeted them was heartbreaking in its careful organization. Boxes labeled in Linda's neat handwriting, furniture wrapped in moving blankets, 40 years of accumulated love and memory reduced to a 10 by 12 concrete rectangle. Linda's hand flew to her mouth, a small sound escaping her throat that might have been a sob or a prayer. Robert stood silent beside her, his jaw working as he stared at the mahogany dining table where Ethan had done his homework, where they'd celebrated birthdays and argued over politics and shared the kind of ordinary moments that only reveal their preciousness when they're gone. Mom, Ethan said softly, stepping into the unit. Help me understand what I'm looking at here. Linda moved deeper into the storage space, her fingers trailing over boxes as if she were reading Braille. These are the Christmas decorations, she said, her voice steadier than he'd expected. And this box has your father's books. He's been collecting first editions for 30 years. She paused at a particular box, lifting the lid to reveal stacks of letters bound with rubber bands. And these are all the cards and letters you sent us over the years. Ethan felt something break open in his chest. Every birthday card, every postcard from business trips, every hastily written note. His parents had kept them all, had treasured them enough to carefully pack them when their world fell apart. There's something else, Robert said quietly, pulling out a wooden box that Ethan recognized with a jolt of memory. Remember this? The model house sat in Robert's weathered hands like a prayer made manifest. Ethan had built it in high school shop class, a perfect scale replica of the home he'd dreamed of giving his parents someday, complete with wraparound porch, bay windows, and a sign over the front door that read, "Where it never rains inside." It was crude work, the product of teenage ambition and limited skill, but his parents had displayed it on their mantel for over 20 years. I thought Olivia threw that away, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. She said it was taking up space, that successful people didn't cling to childhood projects. She tried to, Linda said, a note of steel entering her voice for the first time since he'd found them. Came by about 6 months after your wedding, said she was helping you curate your childhood memories. Wanted to take all sorts of things. Your awards, your photographs, this house. Said you'd outgrown them. But you didn't give them to her? Robert's smile was small but fierce. Son, you made this house with your own 2 hands when you were 16 years old. You told us it was a promise, that someday you'd give us a real house where we'd never have to worry about storms getting inside. No wife gets to throw away a promise like that. The weight of those words settled over Ethan like a physical presence. While he'd been building a tech empire in Seattle, while he'd been conquering markets and accumulating wealth, his parents had been safeguarding the dreams of the boy he'd been. The boy who'd believed that success meant protecting the people you loved, not escaping from them. What else did she want to take? He asked. Linda and Robert exchanged a look, one of those married couple conversations that happened entirely in glances and micro-expressions. The photos, Linda said finally. All the pictures of you growing up here, playing Little League, graduating high school. She said successful people needed to project the right image, that photos of small-town life might limit your potential with certain clients or investors. Ethan sank onto a wrapped chair, the implications washing over him like a tide. Olivia hadn't just wanted to control his present and future. She'd wanted to erase his past, to systematically remove any evidence of the life that had shaped him before she'd entered the picture. She'd been trying to make him into a man with no history, no roots, no identity apart from what she'd helped him construct. There's more, Robert said gently, pulling out a manila envelope from behind the photo albums. We found these when we were packing. They were hidden behind some books on my desk. The envelope contained documents, copies of legal papers, financial statements, correspondence between various law firms and financial institutions. Ethan spread them across the wrapped dining table, his business training helping him quickly parse what he was seeing. These are asset transfers, he said, his voice growing sharp with focus. Someone's been moving property from families in financial distress into a series of shell companies. He looked up at his father. Where did you get these? They were in our house, Robert said, hidden in places we never would have looked. Mrs. Garcia found them when she was helping the sheriffs inventory our belongings for storage. Mrs. Garcia, who had been standing quietly by the unit door, cleared her throat. Mr. Miller, I probably shouldn't say this, but your house wasn't the only one. I've been managing this facility for 12 years, and in the past 3 years, I've seen a lot of families lose their homes very suddenly. Families with successful children who lived far away. Children who never seemed to know what was happening until it was too late. How many families? Ethan asked. 17 that I can think of off the top of my head. Always the same pattern. Older couples, adult children in professional careers, very quick foreclosure proceedings, and then everything ends up here until the storage fees run out and it all goes to auction. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't just about his family, wasn't just about Olivia's need for control over his life. This was a systematic operation, a carefully orchestrated scheme that preyed on successful people's guilt about leaving their hometowns and used that guilt as a weapon against their own families. Mrs. Garcia, he said, standing up with sudden purpose, I need you to help me contact the other families who've been through this, all of them. Mr. Miller. I don't know if that's... I'll pay the storage fees for every family that's been affected, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to making decisions that moved millions of dollars. For as long as it takes to get their belongings back where they belong, and I want to organize a meeting. This week, Robert studied his son's face, seeing something there that reminded him of the determined boy who'd spent months building a model house in the garage, who'd refused to accept anything less than perfection because the gift was too important to be flawed. Son, he said quietly, what are you thinking? Ethan looked around the storage unit at the carefully preserved fragments of his childhood, at the evidence of his parents' unwavering faith in the boy he'd been, at the proof that some promises were too sacred to be broken by time or distance, or the machinations of people who confused love with ownership. "I'm thinking it's time to go home," he said simply. "She forgot that we don't just fight for ourselves, we fight for each other." As they locked up the storage unit and walked back toward their car, the August heat shimmering off the asphalt around them, Ethan Miller felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The absolute certainty that he was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing, in exactly the place he was supposed to be, with exactly the people who mattered most. The war for his family wasn't just beginning. It was about to become something much larger, something that would either restore what had been stolen or reveal once and for all who Ethan Miller really was, when everything he thought he'd built was stripped away. The Willow Creek Community Center hadn't seen a gathering this large since the high school's state championship celebration in 1998. Really go home. And I'm thinking that Olivia underestimated what happens when you try to destroy a Texas family. Folding chairs arranged in concentric circles filled the main hall, and every seat was occupied by faces that carried the same mixture of hope and skepticism that comes from having been burned too many times to trust easily. Ethan stood at the front of the room, looking out at 17 families whose stories had been scattered like leaves in a storm, now brought together by the common thread of their shared devastation. Mrs. Henderson, whose son was a successful cardiologist in Houston, clutched a tissue box in her lap as she spoke about sleeping in her car for 3 weeks before her church took her in. The Rodriguezes, whose daughter managed a law firm in Austin, described watching their belongings disappear into storage while their child remained mysteriously unreachable during her busy season. Story after story unfolded with heartbreaking similarity. Successful children, intercepted communications, expedited foreclosures, and families left bewildered by their abandonment. "What I don't understand," said Jim Carpenter, a retired mechanic whose pilot son lived in Denver, "is why our kids never knew what was happening. Tom and I talk every Sunday, have for years, but these past few months, every time I called, his wife said he was flying international routes. Couldn't be reached." Ethan felt the familiar twist in his chest, the recognition of a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. Around the room, heads nodded with the bitter familiarity of shared experience. "Because they weren't supposed to know," Ethan said, his voice carrying across the room with surprising steadiness. "The people behind this understood that our children's love for us was what made us vulnerable. They turned that love into a weapon by making sure it never had the chance to become action." David Whitman stepped forward from where he'd been taking notes in the back of the room. "What Ethan is describing is a sophisticated form of elder financial abuse that specifically targets families with successful adult children. The perpetrators bank on the fact that busy professionals trust their spouses to handle family communications and that elderly parents will suffer in silence rather than burden their children." A woman named Carol Martinez raised her hand tentatively. "My daughter Maria is a surgeon in Dallas, very successful, very busy. Her husband handles all the family calls, says it's his way of supporting her career. He was always so polite, so helpful." Her voice trailed off as understanding dawned across her features. "How many of your children are married to people who work in finance, law, or business consulting?" Ethan asked. The show of hands was devastating. 14 out of 17 families. "This is organized," said Robert, speaking for the first time since the meeting had begun. "This isn't opportunistic crime. This is a planned operation that's been going on for years." Mrs. Henderson's voice was barely a whisper. "But why? What could they possibly gain from destroying families?" Ethan pulled out the documents they'd found in his parents' belongings, spreading them across the table at the front of the room. "Property, assets, and control over successful people who no longer have any emotional anchors outside their marriages." The room fell silent as David explained what the documents revealed. A network of shell companies acquiring foreclosed properties at below-market rates. often properties that had been in families for generations. The homes were then flipped to developers or held as investment properties, generating substantial profits for the people who had orchestrated their original owners' displacement. "They're stealing our lives," Jim Carpenter said, his voice rough with anger. "Our homes, our families, our futures. And they're using our own children as weapons against us." The weight of that truth settled over the room like a physical presence. These weren't random victims of economic hardship. They were casualties of a calculated assault on the bonds that held families together. "So what do we do?" asked Carol Martinez. "How do we fight people who have turned our own children against us?" Ethan looked around the room at these faces that reminded him of his own parents. Dignified people who had worked their entire lives to build something meaningful, only to have it systematically dismantled by people who saw their love as a commodity to be exploited. "We stop fighting alone," he said, "and we start fighting together." Over the next 2 hours, they developed a plan that would have impressed any corporate strategist. Contact trees to reach their children directly, bypassing the spouses who had been filtering communications. Shared legal resources to challenge the foreclosure proceedings as a group. A media strategy to expose the pattern of abuse before it could spread to other communities. Most importantly, a mutual support network to ensure that no family would face homelessness alone while the legal battles played out. As the meeting began to wind down, Mrs. Henderson approached Ethan with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Miller, I want you to know something. When my husband was dying last year, I called your mother every week. She never once told me about her own troubles, never mentioned the foreclosure or the medical bills or any of it. She just listened to me talk about hospice care and funeral arrangements and kept telling me everything would be okay." Ethan felt his throat close with emotion. While he'd been building his empire in Seattle, while Olivia had been systematically destroying his family's foundation, his mother had been quietly holding up other families who were walking the same devastating path. "That's who she is," he said simply. "That's who they all are. That's what we're fighting for." As the families began to filter out of the community center, making plans to meet again in 2 days, Ethan found himself standing with his parents in the emptying hall. The late evening light slanted through the windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that reminded him of summer evenings from his childhood, when the biggest problem in his world was whether he'd finish his chores in time to catch fireflies before dark. "Son," Robert said quietly, "there's something your mother and I need to tell you." Linda nodded, reaching into her purse to pull out a phone Ethan didn't recognize. "We've been getting calls. From Seattle." Ethan's blood turned to ice. "What kind of calls?" "From Olivia," Linda said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "She's been trying to reach you for 2 days. The messages, they're not angry exactly, but they're not friendly either." Robert handed him the phone, and Ethan scrolled through a series of voicemails that made his skin crawl. Olivia's voice, always so controlled and reasonable, carried an undertone he'd never heard before. Something that might have been desperation or threat or both. "Ethan, darling, I know you're upset about your parents' situation, but we need to discuss this rationally. There are things you don't understand about family dynamics, about protecting the people we love from their own poor decisions. Call me. Ethan, I've been thinking about your parents' financial situation, and I have some ideas about how we can help them. But we need to handle this properly, through the right channels. Don't do anything impulsive." "Ethan, I'm starting to worry about you. You're not responding to calls, you're not thinking clearly. I think you may be having some kind of emotional breakdown. Please come home so we can work through this together." The final message was different, colder. "Ethan, I've spoken with Dr. Richardson about your recent behavior. He agrees that you may be experiencing a psychiatric emergency brought on by stress and guilt. I'm prepared to take whatever steps necessary to protect you from making decisions you'll regret. Come home." The phone trembled in Ethan's hands. "Doctor." Richardson was Olivia's longtime friend, a psychiatrist who specialized in executive mental health. The implication was clear. If Ethan didn't return to Seattle voluntarily, Olivia was prepared to have him declared mentally incompetent, which would give her legal authority over his decisions, his assets, and his ability to help his family. "She's not going to let me go easily," he said, the words coming out flat and emotionless. "No," Robert agreed. "I don't think she is. But, son, you need to understand something. Your mother and I, all these families, we've been broken by this thing, but we're not destroyed. And if you think we're going to stand by and watch someone take you away from us again, you don't know Texas families very well." Linda stepped closer to her son, placing her weathered hand on his cheek with infinite tenderness. "You came home to us, Ethan. You found us in the storm and you didn't turn away. Now we're going to return the favor." As they walked out of the community center together, Ethan understood that the battle he'd thought he was fighting, a legal and financial war against manipulation and fraud, was about to become something far more personal and dangerous. Olivia wasn't just going to fight for control of his assets or his future. She was going to fight for his mind, his freedom, and his identity itself. The boy who had once built a model house as a promise to his parents was about to discover whether the man he'd become was strong enough to keep that promise, even if it meant losing everything else he'd built in the process. The black SUV appeared in the motel parking lot at 7:30 in the morning, its windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever sat inside. Ethan noticed it from his position by the window where he'd been standing since dawn, coffee growing cold in his hands as he watched the Texas sky lighten from purple to pale gold. The vehicle had been circling the block for the past hour, always slow, always deliberate, like a predator testing the perimeter of its hunting ground. His parents were still sleeping, Linda's quiet breathing a counterpoint to Robert's occasional snore. And Ethan found himself grateful for these last moments of peace before whatever storm Olivia had sent their way finally made landfall. The phone calls had stopped after midnight, but the silence felt more ominous than the threats. Olivia had never been the type to accept defeat gracefully, and her 12-year marriage to Ethan had taught her exactly which pressure points would cause the most damage. A knock on the motel room door shattered the morning quiet with the authority of people accustomed to having their demands met immediately. Robert stirred on the bed, his instincts sharpened by 2 months of sleeping in places where safety was never guaranteed. "Mr. Miller?" The voice was professional, neutral, carrying the careful politeness that often preceded devastating news. "This is Deputy Marshal Catherine Wells with the U.S. Marshal Service. I need to speak with you regarding a federal warrant." Ethan's blood turned to ice. Through the window, he could see 2 more vehicles now, their occupants emerging with the measured efficiency of law enforcement professionals executing a carefully planned operation. His parents were awake now, Linda's hand finding Robert's arm in the automatic gesture of people who had learned to face crises together. "What kind of warrant?" Ethan called through the door, his voice steadier than he felt. "Sir, I'm going to need you to open the door so we can discuss this properly. This involves a mental health evaluation order issued by a federal magistrate in Washington state." The words hit Ethan like physical blows. Olivia had moved faster than he'd anticipated, had somehow convinced a federal judge that he posed enough of a danger to himself or others to warrant involuntary psychiatric evaluation. It was a legal maneuver of breathtaking audacity, one that could strip away his freedom, his credibility, and his ability to help his family in a single stroke. Robert was on his feet now, moving with surprising agility for a man of 72. "Son, there's a back window in the bathroom. It leads to the alley behind the diner." "Dad, I can't run from this. If I run, it just proves whatever Olivia told them about my mental state." "And if you go with them," Linda said quietly, her voice carrying the steel that had held their family together through 40 years of marriage, "you disappear into whatever system she's designed to keep you away from us. You think she's going to let you have visitors? You think she's going to let you make phone calls to Texas?" The knocking resumed, more insistent now. "Mr. Miller, I'm required to inform you that this warrant authorizes the use of reasonable force if necessary. Please open the door so we can resolve this peacefully." Ethan found himself thinking about the community meeting the night before, about 17 families who had trusted him to lead a fight against the system that had destroyed their lives, about Mrs. Henderson, who had called his mother every week during her husband's final illness. About Jim Carpenter, whose son, the pilot, remained unreachable while his father faced homelessness. About the storage unit full of memories that Olivia had tried to erase, and the model house that represented a promise he'd made when he was 16 years old and believed that love was stronger than law. "The window," he said finally. Linda was already moving, pulling clothes from their suitcase with the quick efficiency of someone who had grown accustomed to emergency departures. Robert checked the bathroom window, confirming that it opened onto the narrow alley that ran behind the row of businesses that backed up to the motel. "Where will you go?" Linda asked, pressing a bundle of clothes into his hands. "David Whitman's office. If I'm going to fight this, I need to do it from a position of legal strength, not from the back of a federal transport vehicle." The knocking had stopped, replaced by the sound of multiple vehicles repositioning themselves around the motel. Through the front window, Ethan could see officers moving into position with the practiced coordination of people who had done this many times before. Whatever Olivia had told them about his mental state, they were taking it seriously enough to treat him as a potentially dangerous subject. "Mom, Dad," he said, turning to face his parents in what might be their last private moment together for a very long time. "I need you to know something. Whatever happens today, whatever they make you believe about me, I want you to remember that everything I've done since I found you in that storm has been the sanest, most rational thinking of my entire adult life." Linda stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her son with the fierce protectiveness of a mother who had already lost him once and refused to let it happen again. "We know, baby," she whispered against his shoulder. "We know exactly who you are." Robert's embrace was briefer but no less intense. "Son, your grandfather fought in Korea, and he taught me something that I'm going to teach you. Sometimes the most important battles can't be won by playing by the other side's rules. Sometimes you have to make them fight on your ground by your terms." The bathroom window opened with a squeak that seemed impossibly loud in the morning air. Ethan paused on the sill, looking back at his parents one more time. In the amber light filtering through the motel room's thin curtains, they looked exactly as he remembered them from his childhood. Not the broken, exhausted people he'd found sleeping in the rain, but the strong, determined parents who had raised him to believe that doing the right thing was always worth whatever it cost. "I'll call you," he said. "We'll be waiting," Robert replied. Ethan dropped into the alley just as the front door of the motel room splintered open. He could hear the controlled chaos of a law enforcement entry, the professional voices confirming what they already knew, that their target had vanished like morning mist in the Texas heat. As he made his way through the network of alleys and side streets that had been his playground as a child, Ethan Miller understood that he was no longer just fighting to save his family's home or to expose Olivia's manipulation. He was fighting for the fundamental right to choose his own life, to define his own sanity, to protect the people he loved without having that love turned into evidence of mental illness. The successful businessman who had conquered Seattle's tech industry was about to discover what he was truly capable of when backed into a corner by someone who had underestimated the depth of his Texas roots. Olivia might have federal marshals and psychiatric evaluation orders and 12 years of intimate knowledge about his vulnerabilities. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had given him a reason to fight that went deeper than business strategy or financial gain. She had threatened his family, and in Texas, that changed everything. Behind him, the sound of vehicles starting up told him that the hunt was beginning. Ahead of him, the familiar streets of Willow Creek stretched toward whatever sanctuary David Whitman's legal expertise might provide. And somewhere between the past he was running from and the uncertain future he was racing toward, Ethan began to understand that this moment, this desperate flight through the alleys of his childhood, might be the first truly honest thing he'd done in 12 years. The abandoned grain elevator on the outskirts of Willow Creek had been a monument to the town's agricultural past for as long as Ethan could remember. Now, crouched in its shadow while federal marshals searched the streets he'd walked as a boy, it felt like a tomb for the life he'd spent 12 years building. His phone had been buzzing constantly since his escape from the motel. Calls from Seattle, from his office, from numbers he didn't recognize, but he couldn't risk answering any of them. Every electronic device he carried was potentially a beacon leading Olivia's hunters directly to him. David Whitman found him there just after noon, the elderly lawyer moving through the tall grass with surprising stealth for a man in his 70s. He carried a briefcase in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other, his weathered face grim with the kind of news that changed everything. "Son," he said without preamble, settling beside Ethan against the concrete foundation of the old elevator. "We need to talk." Ethan accepted the coffee gratefully, his hands shaking slightly as he wrapped them around the warm metal cup. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that every law enforcement agency in East Texas is looking for you." "Good enough that I think we can beat this thing if we play it smart?" David opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. "The psychiatric evaluation order was issued based on a sworn affidavit from your wife claiming you've suffered a complete mental breakdown. According to her statement, you've become delusional, paranoid, and potentially dangerous to yourself and others." "What kind of evidence did she present?" David's expression grew darker. "Security footage from your office building showing you leaving work abruptly without explanation. Testimony from your assistant about erratic behavior and missed meetings. A psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Richardson, conducted over the phone, mind you, concluding that you're experiencing a psychotic episode triggered by guilt over your parents' financial situation." Ethan felt something cold settle in his stomach. The security footage would show him leaving for his vacation to Texas, but Olivia had obviously presented it as evidence of irrational behavior. His missed meetings were the result of extending his stay to help his family, but without context, they would look like the actions of someone losing touch with reality. "There's more," David continued. "She's filed for emergency conservatorship of your assets, claiming you're no longer capable of making rational financial decisions. If the psychiatric evaluation goes through and finds you incompetent, she gains legal control over everything you own, including your ability to help your family or fund this legal battle." The scope of Olivia's strategy was breathtaking in its completeness. She hadn't just attacked his freedom or his credibility. She'd created a legal framework that would make it impossible for him to fight back effectively. Every move he made to protect his family could be presented as further evidence of his mental instability. "What about the evidence we found? The pattern of foreclosures? The documents from my parents' house?" "That's where things get interesting," David said, pulling out his phone. "I've been in contact with the other families from last night's meeting. Turns out, 3 of them have been getting similar visits from federal authorities. Seems their successful children have all suddenly developed serious mental health crises requiring immediate intervention." Ethan's blood ran cold. "She's doing this to all of them?" "Not just her. This is coordinated, son. Whoever's behind this operation has the resources and connections to manipulate the federal court system, to coordinate law enforcement across multiple jurisdictions, to present a unified front that makes isolated families look like the irrational ones." A mockingbird landed on the rusted machinery above them, its song incongruously cheerful in the afternoon stillness. Ethan found himself thinking about the community meeting, about the hope he'd seen in those families' faces when they'd thought they finally had someone with the resources and knowledge to fight back. Now he was a fugitive hiding in abandoned buildings, about as far from a reliable ally as it was possible to get. "There's something else you need to know," David said quietly. "Your parents are safe, but they're being watched. Federal authorities have placed them in protective custody, ostensibly for their own safety, while their mentally unstable son is on the loose." "Protective custody?" "House arrest, more accurately. They're being held at the community center under the supervision of social services, supposedly to keep them safe from you until you can be properly evaluated and treated." The cruelty of it took Ethan's breath away. Olivia had turned his love for his parents into a weapon against all 3 of them. His escape to avoid psychiatric evaluation was being used as proof that he posed a danger to the very people he was trying to protect. And his parents, who had already suffered through 2 months of homelessness, were now prisoners in their own community, watched by people who believed they needed protection from their own son. "David," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and rage, "what if we're thinking about this all wrong? What if instead of trying to prove I'm not crazy, we focus on proving that the people calling me crazy are criminals?" The old lawyer studied Ethan's face with the intensity of someone who had spent decades reading the truth in people's expressions. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Olivia made a mistake when she escalated this to federal authorities. She's operating under the assumption that I'm going to try to fight this through normal legal channels, that I'm going to surrender myself and try to prove my sanity in a system she's already manipulated. But what if I don't do that? Son, if you're talking about running, about disappearing completely, you need to understand that—" "I'm not talking about running," Ethan interrupted. "I'm talking about investigating. About using the fact that everyone thinks I'm crazy to get close to people who won't see me coming. About turning this whole thing inside out." David was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his briefcase. When he spoke again, his voice carried the careful tone of a lawyer walking into dangerous territory. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we let Olivia think she's won. Let her believe I'm a broken man hiding in the shadows while she consolidates control over my assets and my family. Meanwhile, I use that invisibility to gather evidence about this whole operation. Who's really behind it, how it works, where the money goes. That's extremely dangerous, Ethan. If you're caught, every action you take can be used as evidence of your mental instability. And if you're wrong about being able to expose this conspiracy, then I lose everything anyway," Ethan finished. "But at least I lose it fighting instead of being drugged in some psychiatric facility while my family suffers." A breeze stirred the tall grass around the grain elevator, carrying with it the scent of honeysuckle and the distant sound of traffic on Highway 35. Somewhere in that sound were the lives of ordinary people going about their ordinary business, unaware that their quiet community had become the battleground for something much larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined. "There's one more thing," David said finally. "Your friend Maya from Seattle has been trying to reach me. Says she has information about your wife that she thinks you need to see. Something she found in your office files that she doesn't think you know about." Ethan felt a spark of hope for the first time since he'd crawled through the motel bathroom window. Maya had worked closely with him for 3 years, had access to files and communications that even Olivia might not know about. If there was evidence of the broader conspiracy hidden somewhere in Miller Tech's records, "Can you arrange a secure way for me to talk to her?" "I can try." "You'll be gambling everything on the chance that you can expose this conspiracy before they destroy you completely." Ethan looked out across the Texas landscape that had shaped his childhood, toward the town where his parents were being held prisoner in the name of their own protection, toward the community of families who had trusted him to lead a fight that now seemed impossible to win through conventional means. "David," he said quietly, "I've been playing by their rules my whole adult life, and look where it got me. But Ethan, you need to understand something. Once you go down this road, once you start operating outside the law, there's no going back. My parents are homeless. 17 families have been destroyed, and the woman I've been married to for 12 years has turned out to be someone I never knew at all. Maybe it's time to stop playing by rules that were designed to keep us losing." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Ethan Miller made a decision that would have seemed impossible to the successful businessman who had left Seattle just 4 days earlier. Instead of surrendering to a system that had been corrupted against him, instead of trusting in legal processes that had already been manipulated by his enemies, he would become exactly what they claimed he already was: someone dangerous, unpredictable, and completely outside their control. The only question now was whether the man he'd been before Olivia's influence could remember how to fight dirty enough to win. The abandoned farmhouse sat 15 miles outside Willow Creek, hidden behind a screen of oak trees that had grown wild in the decades since the original owners had given up fighting the Texas heat and economic reality. Maya Rodriguez had found it through a network of contacts that reminded Ethan how much he'd underestimated his assistant's resourcefulness during their 3 years of working together. Now she sat across from him at a kitchen table that had probably hosted family dinners in the 1960s. Her laptop opened between them like a portal into secrets that could either save him or destroy what remained of his life. "I've been digging through your office files since you called," Maya said, her fingers flying across the keyboard with the focused intensity Ethan remembered from countless late-night project deadlines. "At first, I was just trying to understand why Mrs. Miller would file psychiatric papers against you, but what I found goes way deeper than marital problems." On the screen, she pulled up financial records that Ethan recognized but had never examined closely. Expense reports, consulting fees, professional services contracts that Olivia had handled as part of their family's financial planning. What had seemed like routine administrative work now revealed itself as something far more sinister. "Look at these consulting payments," Maya said, highlighting a series of transactions over the past 4 years. "Chen Financial Services, that's your wife's company, has been receiving monthly retainers from 17 different law firms across Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. All of them specialize in elder law and estate planning." Ethan felt his stomach drop. The network was even larger than they'd suspected, spanning multiple states and involving dozens of legal professionals who were perfectly positioned to identify wealthy families with aging parents and successful, distant children. "There's more," Maya continued, opening another file. "These law firms have been sharing client information through something called the Family Asset Protection Network. On paper, it looks like a professional organization focused on helping families navigate complex financial situations. But look at the patterns." The data Maya displayed was devastating in its clarity. The FAPN member firms had systematically identified families where adult children had achieved significant financial success, but maintained emotional distance from their parents. They'd created detailed profiles mapping family dynamics, financial vulnerabilities, and communication patterns. Then they'd use that information to orchestrate interventions that isolated the successful children while accelerating their parents' financial destruction. Olivia wasn't working alone, Ethan said, the pieces finally falling into a picture so comprehensive it took his breath away. "She was part of a network that's been doing this for years." "Gets worse," Maya said grimly. "I found correspondence between your wife and Dr. Richardson going back 6 years. They've been developing what they call intervention protocols for high-net-worth individuals who become emotionally compromised by family obligations." The psychiatric evaluation that had turned Ethan into a fugitive wasn't an emergency response to his recent behavior. It was the final step in a process that had been planned for years. Olivia and her associates had been carefully documenting every instance of his concern for his parents, every moment when family loyalty might interfere with their financial plans, building a case for his mental instability long before any crisis had occurred. "Maya, how many families has this network targeted?" She scrolled through pages of data that represented hundreds of destroyed lives. "Based on what I can find in just your wife's files, at least 63 families across 5 states over the past 4 years. The total value of assets transferred through foreclosure proceedings and estate manipulations comes to approximately $47 million. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering, but what made Ethan's chest tighten with rage was the human cost hidden behind those numbers. 63 families destroyed, hundreds of elderly people displaced, countless relationships severed through carefully orchestrated manipulation. His parents' suffering wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was part of an assembly line of devastation designed to enrich people who saw love as a weakness to be exploited. "There's something else," Maya said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I found emails between your wife and someone identified only as the architect. They're discussing something called Phase 3, which involves expanding the network nationally and targeting families with assets in excess of $5 million. She opened the email thread, and Ethan read over her shoulder as his wife's familiar writing style discussed him and his family with the clinical detachment of a scientist studying laboratory specimens. Subject E continues to demonstrate strong emotional attachment to family of origin despite 12 years of conditioning. Recommend accelerating timeline for asset consolidation and implementing final isolation protocols. Parents successfully displaced and subject becoming increasingly erratic. Psychiatric intervention authorized for next week. Family of origin, Ethan repeated, his voice flat with shock. She calls my parents my family of origin, like there's some kind of biological accident I need to be cured of. It gets worse, Maya said, scrolling to another message. Look at this one from the architect, sent 2 days ago. The message was brief but chilling in its implications. Subject E has proven more resilient than projected models suggested. Recommend immediate implementation of Contingency 7. Network exposure risk increasing. Prepare for full asset liquidation and geographic relocation if containment fails. Ethan stared at the screen, understanding with horrible clarity that he and his family weren't just victims of a financial crime. They were test subjects in an ongoing experiment to see how completely human bonds could be severed for profit. And now that he'd proven unexpectedly difficult to break, the entire network was preparing to disappear, taking their stolen millions and leaving behind only devastated families and unanswered questions. Maya, I need you to copy all of this, everything you can find, and I need you to send it to someone who can't be bought or intimidated. Who did you have in mind? Ethan thought about the community meeting, about 17 families who had trusted him to lead a fight they'd believed was impossible to win, about his parents, locked away under the pretense of their own protection, about Mrs. Henderson, who had called his mother every week during her husband's final illness, never knowing that Linda was facing her own crisis with the same quiet dignity. Send it to Channel 8 in Dallas. Send it to the Houston Chronicle. Send it to every investigative journalist in Texas who's ever written about elder abuse or white-collar crime. His voice was gaining strength, purpose crystallizing from the wreckage of his shock. And send it to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Not the local office. They might be compromised. Go straight to Washington. Maya's fingers were already moving across the keyboard, uploading files to secure servers and composing emails that would turn a carefully hidden conspiracy into front-page news. Ethan, you realize this is going to destroy your wife and everyone involved in this network, but it's also going to make you a target. If they're willing to manipulate federal courts and law enforcement agencies, they're not going to hesitate to do whatever it takes to silence you. Let them try, Ethan said. And for the first time since he'd found his parents sleeping in the rain, he felt like himself again. Not the confused, devastated son or the desperate fugitive, but the determined businessman who had built a company from nothing through sheer force of will. They made one crucial mistake, Maya. They underestimated what happens when you threaten a Texas family. They thought they could break us apart, turn our love against us, make us disappear quietly into their system. He stood up, pacing to the farmhouse window, where the late afternoon sun painted the abandoned fields in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, he could see the grain elevator where he'd hidden that morning, where David Whitman had brought him the news that had seemed like the end of everything. Now it looked different, not like a tomb for his old life, but like the foundation for something new and stronger. They forgot that some things can't be broken, he continued, his reflection in the dusty glass looking back at him with eyes that carried a resolve he hadn't felt in 12 years. Some bonds can't be severed, and some fights are worth losing everything for. Maya closed the laptop, her work complete. The information that would bring down the Family Asset Protection Network was already winging its way across the country, landing in the inboxes of reporters and federal agents who would soon understand that they were looking at one of the most sophisticated elder abuse conspiracies in American history. "What happens now?" she asked. Ethan turned back to her, and for the first time in days, his smile was genuine. "Now we go home. Really go home. And we start rebuilding everything they tried to destroy." As they prepared to leave the farmhouse, Ethan understood that the man who had fled through a motel bathroom window was gone forever. In his place stood someone harder, more focused, tempered by betrayal but not broken by it. The boy who had once promised his parents a house where it never rained inside was about to discover whether the man he'd become could keep that promise, even after everything they'd all endured. The battle for his family was ending. The war for justice was just beginning. The news broke at 6 o'clock on Thursday morning, spreading across Texas like wildfire through drought-stricken prairie. By sunrise, every major news outlet in the state was running variations of the same devastating exposé. Multi-million-dollar elder abuse network exposed. Texas families systematically destroyed by financial conspiracy. Federal authorities launch investigation into sophisticated family manipulation scheme. Ethan watched the coverage from David Whitman's office, where he'd surrendered himself to federal authorities at dawn, flanked by lawyers and armed with enough evidence to transform his status from fugitive mental patient to key witness in a federal investigation. Channel 8's investigative team had worked through the night, cross-referencing Maya's leaked documents with their own sources, building an airtight story that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. The psychiatric evaluation order had been quietly withdrawn as FBI agents realized they were dealing with someone who had blown the lid off one of the most sophisticated white-collar crimes in recent memory. But the legal vindication felt hollow as Ethan stared at the television screen, watching his private family tragedy become public spectacle. Reporters stood outside the Willow Creek Community Center, where his parents remained in protective custody, their cameras capturing the building where 17 families had trusted him to lead a fight he'd almost lost before it began. "Son," David said gently, switching off the television. "It's time." The community center looked different in the harsh light of media attention. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking sun, while reporters delivered breathless updates about the unfolding scandal. Ethan walked through the crowd with his head down, flanked by FBI agents who parted the sea of cameras and microphones with professional efficiency. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with vindication and exhaustion. The 17 families who had gathered here a week ago now found themselves at the center of a national story, their quiet suffering transformed into evidence of systemic criminal enterprise. But Ethan's eyes were focused on only two people in the crowded room. Linda and Robert sat together on a folding chair near the back wall, holding hands with the desperate intensity of people who had learned that separation could come without warning. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the chaos swirling around them, by the knowledge that their private pain had become a matter of public record and federal investigation. Ethan approached them slowly, aware that every person in the room was watching, that his first words to his parents since becoming a fugitive would set the tone for whatever came next. The successful businessman who had conquered Seattle's tech industry was gone, replaced by a son who had learned that some victories required you to lose everything you thought you wanted. Mom, Dad. His voice was quiet, careful, carrying none of the authority he'd wielded in boardrooms and conference calls. "I'm sorry for everything you've been through, for bringing this chaos into your lives, for not being here when you needed me." Linda's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Oh, honey, you found us. You came home and you found us, and you didn't turn away even when it meant losing everything else." She reached for his hand, her fingers thin but strong. "That's not something to apologize for. That's something to be proud of." Robert's embrace was brief but fierce, carrying 12 years of missed conversations and the relief of a father who had wondered if he'd ever hold his son again. "You did good, Ethan. You did real good." The simple words broke something open in Ethan's chest, releasing emotions he'd been holding back since the moment he'd climbed through that motel bathroom window. He sank into the chair beside his parents, feeling for the first time in days that he could breathe fully. Around them, the other families were experiencing their own moments of reunion as children arrived from across the country, summoned by news reports and FBI notifications. The Martinez family hugged their surgeon daughter from Dallas, who had driven through the night after learning how her communications had been intercepted. Jim Carpenter's pilot's son had flown in from Denver, his face grim with the understanding of how completely he'd been manipulated. "Ethan," Mrs. Henderson said, approaching their small circle with tears streaming down her cheeks. "I wanted you to know that my son Michael is driving down from Houston. He'll be here this afternoon." She paused, struggling with words. "He said the FBI called him directly, told him everything. He said he's been trying to reach me for months, but his wife kept telling him I was fine, that I was busy with church activities and didn't want to be bothered." The pattern repeated itself throughout the room as family after family discovered how systematically their communications had been severed, how their love for each other had been turned into a weapon of isolation and control. The scope of the conspiracy was revealed not just in financial documents and legal filings, but in the raw human cost visible in every embrace, every tear, every whispered apology for not knowing, not seeing, not being there. "What happens now?" Linda asked quietly, her hand still clasped in Ethan's. "Now we rebuild," he said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "The FBI will handle the criminal prosecution, but that's just the legal part. The real work is putting our families back together, helping everyone who was hurt by this thing." He looked around the room at the faces that had become familiar over the past week, people who had trusted him when he was at his lowest point, who had followed him into a fight that had seemed impossible to win. Now they were all looking to him again, but this time not as a successful businessman who might have the resources to save them. They were looking to him as someone who understood what it meant to have everything stolen and still find the strength to fight back. "I want to propose something," he said, standing up so his voice would carry across the crowded room. "I want to create something permanent. Something that will make sure this never happens to another family." The conversations gradually quieted as people turned their attention to the man who had exposed the conspiracy that had destroyed their lives. "I'm going to establish a foundation," Ethan continued, "not just to provide temporary assistance, but to build a support network for families who are vulnerable to this kind of manipulation. Legal aid, financial counseling, communication systems that can't be hijacked by people who profit from our separation." Mrs. Martinez raised her hand tentatively. "What would you call something like that?" Ethan looked at his parents, sitting together in their folding chairs like anchors in a storm that had nearly swept away everything they'd built over 40 years of marriage. He thought about the model house that had survived Olivia's attempts to erase his past, about the promise he'd made as a 16-year-old boy who believed that love was stronger than economics or law or the accumulated weight of adult compromise. "The Miller Family Foundation," he said simply. "A place where it never rains inside." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming, applause that grew from scattered clapping into something that felt like a celebration, like the sound of people who had lost everything discovering that some things couldn't be stolen. But Ethan's eyes were focused on his parents, on the way Linda's face lit up with understanding, on the way Robert's weathered features softened with pride. Outside, the news crews were already preparing their evening broadcasts, transforming a day of family reunions into sound bites about justice and redemption. But inside the community center, surrounded by people who had learned that love was both more fragile and more resilient than they'd ever imagined, Ethan Miller began to understand that the most important victories happen not in courtrooms or corporate boardrooms, but in moments when broken families decided to trust each other enough to start over. The boy who had built a model house as a promise was about to discover whether the man he'd become could keep that promise for 17. Families who had nowhere else to turn for shelter from the storms that others had sent to destroy them. 3 weeks later, the sound of hammers and power tools echoed across Willow Creek Lane as a small army of volunteers worked to transform the abandoned Miller house back into a home. The foreclosure had been overturned as part of the federal investigation, and the keys had been returned to Robert and Linda with the kind of ceremony that small towns reserve for moments when justice finally prevails over bureaucracy. But getting the keys back was only the beginning. The house itself bore the scars of abandonment and neglect, of months when no one had cared enough to maintain what 4 decades of love had built. Ethan knelt on the front porch, carefully sanding the weathered boards that had once been painted blue but now showed the gray exhaustion of wood that had endured too many storms without protection. The work was methodical, meditative, giving his hands something to do while his mind processed the changes that had swept through his life like a cleansing flood. 2 weeks ago, he had been a fugitive hiding in grain elevators. Today, he was a man rebuilding his childhood home with his own hands, surrounded by neighbors who had known him when he was young enough to believe that all problems could be solved with enough determination and elbow grease. "You missed a spot," Linda said, settling beside him on the porch with 2 glasses of sweet tea that caught the late afternoon sunlight like amber promises. "I missed several spots," Ethan admitted, accepting the tea gratefully. "I'm better with keyboards than Sanders, apparently. Good thing you've got plenty of time to learn." The words carried weight beyond their casual delivery. Ethan had resigned from Miller Tech the day after the FBI raided Olivia's offices, turning over control of the company to his management team, while he focused on what he'd discovered mattered more than stock options and quarterly earnings reports. The tech industry would survive without him, but his family needed him here, now, in ways that couldn't be delegated or postponed. "Any word from the lawyers about Olivia?" Linda asked carefully. Ethan set down his sandpaper, watching a mockingbird defend its nest in the oak tree that had shaded his childhood bedroom window. The divorce proceedings were moving forward with the efficient brutality of legal machinery applied to the wreckage of a 12-year marriage. Olivia had been arrested on federal conspiracy charges, along with 16 other members of the Family Asset Protection Network. The woman he'd thought he'd loved had turned out to be someone he'd never really known at all. "She wants to make a deal," he said finally. "Testimony against the architect in exchange for a reduced sentence. Have they identified who that is yet?" "Dr. Richardson. Turns out he's been coordinating this whole operation from his psychiatric practice in Seattle, using his access to high-net-worth families to identify targets and develop intervention strategies." Ethan's voice was flat, drained of emotion by the sheer scope of the betrayal he was still processing. "He's been doing this for 8 years, moving from city to city, building networks of lawyers and financial consultants who prey on successful people's guilt about leaving their families behind." Linda was quiet for a moment, her weathered hands wrapped around her tea glass. "You know what the hardest part is for your father and me?" "What?" "It's not the money we lost or the house or even the 2 months we spent homeless. It's the time we can't get back. The phone calls we didn't get to make. The conversations we didn't get to have. The birthdays and holidays when we thought you'd forgotten about us." The words hit harder than any federal indictment or financial settlement ever could. Ethan set down his tea and turned to face his mother, seeing in her face the accumulated weight of 1,000 small heartbreaks that money couldn't heal. "Mom, I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty, honey. I'm telling you because that's what we're really rebuilding here. Not just the house, not just our bank account. We're rebuilding trust, rebuilding connection, rebuilding the time that was stolen from us." As if summoned by her words, Robert appeared around the corner of the house, carrying a cardboard box that Ethan recognized with a jolt of memory. It was the same box that had held his high school awards, his Little League trophies, his collection of science fiction novels, artifacts of the boy he'd been before the world had grown complicated enough to require choices between success and love. "Found these in the storage unit," Robert said, setting the box on the porch between them. "Thought you might want to go through them. Maybe decide what belongs in your old room." Ethan opened the box with the careful reverence of an archaeologist uncovering a lost civilization. Inside were the fragments of a life he'd almost forgotten he'd lived, photographs of him in his high school graduation cap, certificates for academic achievements that had meant everything when he was 18, a letter from the dean of engineering at UT congratulating him on his admission. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was the deed to the model house he'd built in shop class. The miniature structure was more fragile than he remembered. Its wooden walls thin enough to reveal the careful craftsmanship of a teenager who'd believed that love could be measured in the precision of hand-cut joints and meticulously applied paint. "I was thinking," Robert said quietly, settling on the porch step beside his wife, "that maybe it's time to build the real version." Ethan looked up from the model, meeting his father's eyes across decades of separation and misunderstanding. "Dad? This house has good bones, but it's seen better days. What if we didn't just restore it? What if we expanded it, made it into something that could hold more than just our family? Something that could be a real shelter for people who need a place where storms can't reach them?" The idea took shape between them like morning mist condensing into rain. A house that was also a foundation headquarters, a place where families torn apart by manipulation and greed could come to rebuild their connections. Guest rooms for elderly parents who needed temporary shelter, meeting spaces for support groups and legal aid clinics. A demonstration that healing was possible, that love could be stronger than the forces that tried to divide it. "The Miller family house," Linda said softly, her voice carrying the same wonder it had held when she'd first seen her son's model construction 30 years ago. "Where it never rains inside," Ethan finished. That evening, as the volunteer work crews packed up their tools and headed home to their own families, Ethan found himself alone on the porch with his parents for the first time since he'd found them sleeping in the storm. The house around them was still half-finished, still bearing the scars of abandonment and neglect. But something essential had been restored, not just to the building, but to the relationships it sheltered. "Son," Robert said as the last of the sunset faded from the Texas sky, "there's something I want you to know." "What's that, Dad?" "When you were 16 and you showed us that model house, told us it was a promise you were making, your mother and I knew you meant it. But we also knew that life has a way of changing people's priorities, changing what seems important. We never expected you to actually keep that promise." Linda nodded, her hand finding Ethan's in the growing darkness. "But you did keep it, honey. Maybe not the way you planned, maybe not when you expected to, but you kept it. You gave us a place where it never rains inside, where we're safe from the storms that other people send our way. And now," Robert continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had lived long enough to see justice prevail, "you're going to give that same gift to 17 other families who need to remember what it feels like to be sheltered by something stronger than weather." As stars began to appear in the clear Texas sky, Ethan Miller sat between his parents on the porch of his childhood home, surrounded by the sounds of a community rebuilding itself from the wreckage of betrayal and loss. Tomorrow would bring more work, legal proceedings to finalize, foundation paperwork to establish, families to reconnect with their stolen lives. But tonight, there was only this: the simple presence of people who loved each other enough to fight for their right to remain together, no matter what forces tried to tear them apart. The model house sat on the porch railing beside them, its miniature windows glowing in the light from the living room where Linda had hung new curtains that afternoon. It was no longer a promise waiting to be kept, but evidence of a promise fulfilled, proof that some things were worth any sacrifice, any struggle, any cost. The boy who had built it was gone, replaced by a man who had learned that the most important foundations weren't made of wood and nails, but of trust and time and the patient work of rebuilding what others had tried to destroy. 6 months after the scandal broke, the Miller family house stood as a testament to what could be. Rebuilt from the wreckage of broken trust. The original structure had been expanded and transformed into something that honored its past, while embracing a larger purpose: guest rooms for displaced families, offices for legal aid volunteers, a commercial kitchen where Linda Miller organized weekly dinners that brought together people who had learned that shared meals could heal wounds that law enforcement and legal proceedings couldn't touch. Ethan stood in the main gathering room, watching the afternoon light stream through. windows that faced both east and west, ensuring that no part of the day would pass without sunshine, touching the space where 17 families had first come together to fight for their right to exist as units of love rather than targets of profit. On the walls hung photographs that told the story of their collective recovery. The Hendersons in front of their reclaimed farmhouse, the Martinez family at their daughter's medical conference where she'd been honored for her work on elder care advocacy, Jim Carpenter teaching his pilot son to rebuild the engine on his 1967 Mustang. "Mr. Miller?" A soft voice interrupted his contemplation, and he turned to see Sarah Chen, a young woman whose grandmother had been among the latest victims discovered by the FBI's expanding investigation. The network had been even larger than anyone had initially suspected, reaching into 12 states and affecting over 200 families before Maya's leaked documents had brought the entire operation crashing down. "Please, call me Ethan. What can I help you with?" Sarah clutched a manila folder against her chest, her eyes carrying the particular mixture of hope and skepticism that had become familiar to Ethan over the past months. "I wanted to thank you for what you've done for my grandmother. Mrs. Lee is 84 years old, and when her house was foreclosed, she was too proud to tell our family what was happening. She'd been sleeping in her car for 3 weeks before your foundation found her. How is she adjusting to the temporary housing? That's what I wanted to talk to you about." Sarah opened her folder, revealing architectural drawings that were clearly the work of a professional. "I'm a civil engineer in Austin, and I've been thinking about your expansion plans for the foundation. What if we didn't just provide temporary housing? What if we created permanent communities designed specifically for families recovering from this kind of manipulation?" The drawings showed clusters of small houses connected by covered walkways and communal gardens, designed to provide privacy while maintaining the connections that predators had tried to sever. Each cluster centered around a larger building that could serve as a community center, with spaces for meals, meetings, and the kind of casual interactions that helped rebuild trust between family members who had been taught to doubt each other's motives. "This is incredible work," Ethan said, studying the careful attention to detail that reminded him of his own teenage model building. "But something like this would require significant funding, land acquisition, zoning approvals. I've been working with 3 other families affected by the network," Sarah said, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. "The Rodriguezes have connections in municipal government. The Carpenter family owns construction equipment, and my firm specializes in sustainable community development. We're not just talking about charity. We're talking about creating a replicable model that could be built in communities across the country." The scope of her vision was breathtaking, transforming the Miller Family Foundation from a local response to a specific crisis into something that could address the broader epidemic of elder isolation and family manipulation that the FBI investigation had revealed. But what moved Ethan most was the way she spoke about the project, not as beneficiaries seeking help, but as partners bringing their own skills and resources to solve a problem that affected them all. "What would you need from the foundation to make this happen?" "Honestly, not money. What we need is what you've already created here, proof that it's possible, that families can rebuild trust after it's been systematically destroyed. We need your story, your parents' story, as evidence that love can be stronger than the forces that try to divide us." Before Ethan could respond, the front door opened to admit Linda and Robert, returning from their daily walk around the neighborhood that had once again become home. At 74 and 76 respectively, they moved with the careful deliberation of people who had survived more than their share of storms, but their faces carried a contentment that hadn't been there during the dark months when homelessness had threatened to break their spirits permanently. "Sarah!" Linda's face lit up with genuine warmth as she embraced the young woman who had become a regular visitor since her grandmother's rescue. "How are the plans coming along?" "I was just showing Ethan the latest drawings. I think we're ready to start looking for the first site." Robert studied the architectural plans with the focused attention of a man who had spent decades building things with his hands. "This is good work," he said finally. "Reminds me of something Ethan built when he was in high school. Thoughtful, purposeful, designed to last." The comment drew Ethan's attention to a corner of the room where his original model house now sat in a place of honor, no longer the centerpiece of his childhood bedroom, but a symbol of promises kept and dreams expanded beyond their original scope. Beside it sat a newer model, a miniature version of Sarah's community design that she'd built to help explain her vision to potential partners and investors. "You know what I love most about this design?" Linda said, pointing to the covered walkways that connected the individual houses. "It gives people privacy when they need it, but it also makes sure they never have to be alone unless they choose to be. It's like what we've built here, but bigger. Much bigger," Sarah agreed. "The preliminary site survey suggests we could house 48 families in the first community, with room for expansion if the model proves successful." As they discussed zoning requirements and funding strategies, Ethan found himself stepping back from the conversation, watching his parents engage with Sarah's plans with the enthusiasm of people who had discovered that their own suffering could become the foundation for preventing others' pain. This was what recovery looked like. Not just the restoration of what had been lost, but the transformation of loss into purpose, of survival into service. The late afternoon sun was painting the room in shades of gold and amber when Maya Rodriguez arrived for the weekly foundation meeting, carrying a tablet that contained updates on the ongoing federal prosecution and the ever-expanding list of families seeking help. The conspiracy trials were proceeding slowly but steadily, with Olivia's cooperation helping to build cases against the higher-level operatives who had orchestrated the network's expansion. "Any word on Dr. Richardson's sentencing?" Robert asked, as Maya set up her presentation. 25 to life, with restitution orders that will probably keep him in debt for the rest of his natural life," Maya replied with the grim satisfaction of someone who had seen justice served after months of uncertainty. The judge said this was one of the most sophisticated and cruel criminal enterprises she'd ever encountered. The psychological damage assessment alone ran to over 300 pages. "What about the other families? The ones we haven't been able to reach yet?" Maya's expression softened. "That's actually why I wanted to meet today. The FBI has identified 237 families affected by the network across 12 states. Most of the adult children still don't know what really happened. They still believe their parents chose to cut contact, that the isolation was voluntary. The weight of that number settled over the room like a physical presence. 237 families torn apart by manipulation so sophisticated that many of the victims still blamed themselves for the destruction of relationships that had been systematically sabotaged by people they'd trusted. "We have our work cut out for us," Ethan said quietly. "Yes," Sarah agreed, rolling up her architectural drawings with the careful precision of someone who understood that good plans required patient execution. "We have this place, these relationships, this community as evidence that healing is possible." As the meeting wound down and people began to head home to their own families that had been given the chance to rebuild because one son had refused to accept that love was a luxury successful people couldn't afford, Ethan found himself alone with his parents in the room where it had all started. "Proud of you, son," Robert said simply, settling into the chair that had become his. "Customary spot for evening conversations. But we also have proof that the work can be done. Not just for what you've built, but for who you've become while building it." Linda nodded, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "The boy who made us that promise about a house where it never rains inside has grown into a man who's keeping that promise for hundreds of families. That's not success. That's something much more important." "What's that?" "That's a life well lived. That's a legacy worth leaving behind." As darkness fell over Willow Creek and the lights of the Miller family house glowed like a beacon for anyone seeking shelter from storms, both literal and metaphorical, Ethan understood that the most important journey of his life was just beginning. The tech empire he'd built in Seattle would become a footnote in business magazines, but the foundation he was building here would outlast him, would continue providing shelter long after he was gone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families seeking help, new opportunities to prove that some things couldn't be stolen or destroyed or manipulated into disappearance. But tonight, there was only this: the simple presence of people who loved each other enough to fight for their right to remain together, surrounded by the evidence that such fights could be won. The boy who had built a model house as a promise had become a man whose life itself was the kept promise, whose story would give hope to others facing their own storms. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for: the chance to matter, to make a difference, to leave the world a little more sheltered than they'd found it. 1 year to the day after Ethan Miller had found his parents sleeping in the rain, he stood once again on the front porch of their family home. But this time the scene was transformed by celebration rather than crisis. The Miller Family Foundation's first anniversary gala filled the house and spilled into the gardens that Linda had spent months coaxing back to life, where Japanese lanterns cast warm light over conversations between families who had traveled from across the country to share their stories of recovery and rebuilding. The guest of honor sat in her wheelchair near the rose bushes that Robert had planted in memory of the 2 months they'd spent homeless, her 92-year-old face radiating the particular satisfaction that comes from witnessing justice prevail against impossible odds. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield had been the network's first known victim, displaced from her Dallas home 8 years earlier when her son, a successful heart surgeon, had been convinced by his new wife that his elderly mother's financial struggles were a sign of dementia requiring institutional care. The FBI had found her in a state-funded facility where she'd spent 6 years believing her son had abandoned her, never knowing that every letter she'd written had been intercepted, every phone call blocked by people who saw her love for her child as a threat to their own control. "Mrs. Whitfield," Ethan said, settling into the garden chair beside her wheelchair, "I wanted to thank you for coming tonight. I know the travel was difficult." "Nonsense," she replied, her voice carrying the steel that had helped her survive decades of manipulation without losing her faith in the possibility of reunion. "When my son Michael called to tell me about this place, about what you've built here, I told him wild horses couldn't keep me away. A house where it never rains inside, that's poetry, young man. That's the kind of promise the world needs more of." Around them, the anniversary celebration continued with the easy warmth of people who had learned to treasure ordinary moments of connection. Children played tag between the tables, while their grandparents shared stories of courtrooms and legal victories, of homes reclaimed and relationships restored. The Martinez family demonstrated the community garden techniques they'd developed at their own foundation site in Austin, while Jim Carpenter's pilot son showed off the restored 1967 Mustang that had become their shared project in rebuilding trust one afternoon at a time. "Ethan," a familiar voice called from the house, and he turned to see Sarah Chen approaching with a young man he didn't recognize. "I want you to meet someone. This is David Huang, Mrs. Whitfield's grandson. He's starting his residency in geriatric psychiatry next month, and he's interested in developing treatment protocols for families affected by systematic manipulation." David stepped forward with the earnest intensity of someone who understood that his chosen profession had been weaponized against the people he'd trained to help. "Mr. Miller, I wanted you to know that your story, your family's story, is already being used in medical schools to teach recognition of elder abuse disguised as mental health intervention. What happened to my grandmother? To your parents? It's changing how we train doctors to identify when family dynamics are being artificially manipulated." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Maya Rodriguez, who carried a tablet and wore the expression of someone bearing significant news. Over the past year, she had become the Foundation's coordinator of family reunification, tracking down isolated elderly parents and estranged adult children across the country, using the network's own documentation to rebuild connections that had been systematically severed. "Ethan, I have an update you need to hear," she said, pulling him aside to a quieter corner of the garden. "We've successfully contacted all 237 families identified by the FBI investigation. As of this afternoon, we've facilitated reunions for 189 families, with legal proceedings ongoing for the remainder. The numbers represented more than statistics. They represented countless individual moments like the one happening around them tonight. families choosing to trust each other enough to start over, to rebuild what had been stolen from them by people who had confused love with weakness. What about the community development project? Sarah's housing initiative? Maya's smile was radiant, breaking ground on the first site next month in Austin. 3 more sites approved for development in Houston, Dallas, and Oklahoma City. The governor's office has asked us to present our model to the state legislature as a potential template for addressing elder homelessness statewide. And funding? Completely sustainable. It turns out that when you give people the chance to use their own skills to solve problems that affect them personally, they don't need charity. They need partnership. Every family we've helped has found ways to contribute resources, expertise, or labor to help the next family. At 75, she moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned that every day of health was a gift to be treasured, every moment of family connection a victory against the forces that had tried to tear them apart. "Son," she said, setting the cobbler on the garden table, "your father and I have been talking, and we have something we want to tell you." Robert joined them, emerging from a conversation with a group of Foundation volunteers who had been discussing expansion, plans for the legal aid clinic. It's become a self-sustaining network of mutual aid. As if summoned by their conversation, Linda appeared at Ethan's elbow, carrying a plate of her famous peach cobbler and wearing the expression of a woman who had something important to say. His weathered hands carried a manila folder that looked official enough to contain important documents. "What is it, Dad?" "We want to deed this house to the Foundation," Robert said simply. "Make it permanent. Make sure it can never be taken away from the families who need it, no matter what happens to any of us individually." The gesture took Ethan's breath away. The house on Willow Creek Lane represented everything his parents had built over 4 decades of marriage, every sacrifice they'd made to create stability and love in an uncertain world. To give it away, to transform their private sanctuary into a public trust, was an act of generosity that redefined what legacy could mean. "Are you sure?" he asked. "This is your home, your life's work." "Honey," Linda said, her eyes bright with unshed tears, "our life's work isn't this building. Our life's work is what we built inside this building. The love, the connection, the belief that families should protect each other instead of being used against each other. We want that work to continue long after we're gone. Besides," Robert added with a smile that reminded Ethan of the father who had taught him that a man's word was the foundation upon which everything else was built, "you already kept your promise about giving us a house where it never rains inside. Now it's time to keep that promise for as many families as possible." As the anniversary celebration continued around them, families sharing meals and stories under the Texas stars, Ethan understood that this moment represented more than the conclusion of a year's work. It represented the beginning of something that could outlast them all. The boy who had built a model house as a promise had become a man whose entire life had become the kept promise, whose story would continue inspiring others to believe that love could be stronger than greed, that trust could be rebuilt after betrayal, that families could choose to shelter each other from any storm. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and the lanterns had been extinguished, Ethan sat with his parents on the front porch where his journey had begun with the discovery of 2 people he loved sleeping in the rain. The model house sat on the railing beside them, its miniature windows glowing in the light from the living room where tomorrow's foundation meetings would be held, where families seeking shelter would find not just temporary housing, but permanent proof that some promises were too important to be broken. "So what happens next?" Linda asked, her hand finding Robert's in the automatic gesture of people who had learned that love required both daily choice and lifetime commitment. Ethan looked out across the neighborhood where porch lights twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a family choosing to trust in the possibility of connection despite everything the world had taught them about the dangers of vulnerability. Somewhere in the darkness, other families were facing their own storms, their own moments of crisis, when love would be tested against fear, when the choice between shelter and abandonment would define everything that came after. "Next," he said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had learned that the most important victories weren't won in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in moments when broken people decided to trust each other enough to start over. We keep the says. Promise. For as long as it takes, for as many families as need it, we keep the promise that there will always be a place where it never rains inside. And in the silence that followed, filled with the gentle sounds of a Texas evening and the presence of people who had chosen love over fear, Ethan Miller understood that some journeys never really ended. They just transformed into new beginnings, new opportunities to prove that the most important foundations weren't made of money or success or even justice, but of the simple, revolutionary decision to believe that families could be stronger than the forces that tried to tear them apart. The promise had been kept. The work would continue. And somewhere in the distance, morning was coming to Willow Creek, bringing with it new chances to build, to heal, to shelter, and to prove once again that love was the most practical force in the universe, if you were brave enough to choose it over everything else the world had to offer.